NBC presents I Remember Kaltenborn. But first, let me take a moment to bring you a few NBC program notes. Saturday evening, the Camel Caravan stars Vaughn Monroe and the orchestra in a musical salute to the University of Georgia. Then on Sunday, The Big Show features Jane Russell, The Continental, Judy Canova, Herb Jeffries, and your glamorous hostess, Tallulah Bankhead, with Meredith Wilson directing The Big Show Orchestra and Chorus. Later Sunday evening, Theater Guild on the Air presents the comedy success The Silver Whistle, co-starring Diana Lynn and James Stewart. Yes, stay tuned to NBC. Now it's I Remember Kaltenborn on NBC.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ben Grauer speaking to you, transcribed on a historic occasion. Exactly 30 years ago to the day, H.V. Kaltenborn stood before an old-style carbon microphone and delivered his first broadcast. So tonight we are celebrating H.V.'s 30th anniversary as a radio news commentator. Now let me show you what I mean by a news commentator. I've been thumbing through some transcriptions of Kaltenborn broadcasts from years back. I've come upon one from April 1947. Someone had rushed into H.V.'s studio and handed him a bulletin. So first we got the news.
Then it's of special interest to Brooklyn folks, for it concerns the Dodgers. Well, how? A new manager to take Leo DeRusher's place has just been named. He's Bert Schotten, the former manager of the Philadelphia Phillies, who's been a scout for the Dodgers for several years. Schotten will pilot the Brooklyn Ball Club through 1947 in place of Leo the Lip.
That was the news. Then, of course, H.V. gave his commentary. Brief, but to the point.
Let's hope there'll be less lip and more action.
And, of course, H.V.'s keen analysis of the situation in Brooklyn was quite correct. Bert Schotten got action in Brooklyn in 1947. That year, the Dodgers won the National League pennant. And this is just one of H.V.'s many facets that have made him a legend in the radio business during these 30 years. All of us have our favorite stories about him. I have mine. Bill Henry of Mutual has his. Elmer Davis of ABC his. Bob Trout of CBS is by way of being a student of the Kaltenborn legend. Mary Margaret McBride of ABC is an old friend of H.V.'s, and so, of course, is Edward R. Murrow of CBS. And we're all going to talk about him for a while. We'll hear from H.V. himself later on, and we've brought in a guest who shall remain nameless for the moment to make sure that H.V. doesn't talk beyond the half hour NBC has allotted to us here. Well, as I was saying, H.V. is a man of many facets. One of my own fondest recollections of him is the time he juggled 3 baseballs in a quiz program. Who said that? Also on the panel was no less an authority on juggling baseballs than Dizzy Dean. When I tuned in, Dizzy was apparently having trouble understanding some of H.V.'s fancy verbiage.
I've been reading a dictionary all week. I'll be darned if I haven't heard more words tonight I never seen in a dictionary all week. That's something I can't do is read, and we've been talking about books. The words I've heard tonight I've never seen in the dictionary, I'll tell you.
I should like to say to Mr. Dean, with a profound conviction that I am right, that the master of the solecism should not consult the dictionary too much. Otherwise, he will lose his kingship of the solicistic tribe.
I tell you, Mr. Kaltenborn, I hope that those people out there understood what you were saying, because I don't know what in the world you mean when you But I know that they probably, I wish they had a couple of 3 baseballs around here. I'd like to see what you could do with one of them.
Dizzy, I've got the balls. I brought some baseballs because my grandson is a great baseball fan. And would you autograph them for him?
Be more than glad to.
Fine.
What can you do with these baseballs?
Well, 50 years ago, I used to be able to juggle 2 baseballs with one hand. But whether I can do it now or not, I don't know.
If you can, I'll guarantee you there's about 16 big league ball clubs like sign you up.
And if I do, will you put $10 in the bowl?
I'll be glad to.
Oh, say, this is tough. 50 years and no practice. Every good performer misses the first time.
You know, it's a funny thing. There's a lot of outfielders in the big leagues that can't catch one of these, and here you are catching three.
By now, you don't need me to tell you that H.V. is a man of boundless energy, physical as well as intellectual. It goes without saying that he wants to be on the scene of any big story. When there's been a chance for pioneering, H.V. has pioneered. He was one of the first, for example, to broadcast news from overseas. Perhaps many of you remember his first-hand reports on the Spanish War. He did them from the little town of Hendaye on the French side of the Spanish border.
This is H.V. Kaltenborn speaking to you from the famous Imat's Hotel at Hendaye, France, just across the Spanish border. I have just come from a talk with the United States Ambassador Powers, who returned today to France on the Cayuga with 17 refugees, including 3 Americans. He reports that the province of Galicia in the south, from which we have heard scarcely anything since the Spanish Revolution began, is entirely in rebel hands. An ambassador who is related to this particular situation must be extremely careful, because both sides are very eager to misconstrue to their own advantage anything that he may say or do. Perhaps that is the reason that Ambassador Bowers, instead of talking to you tonight...
And who can ever forget H.V.'s broadcasting during the Munich crisis of 1938? He made 102 broadcasts during the 20 days of that crisis, analyzing the situation step by step as it developed. What I recall best of that is one line, perhaps his final line of the crisis. Chamberlain had returned home to predict there would be peace in our time. The British were rejoicing. But H.V. wrapped it up like this.
Today they ring the bells. Tomorrow they may wring their hands.
Now, one thing you should know about H.V. Kaltenborn at this point. Scarcely a year has passed during the last half-century that he hasn't taken off for parts unknown. If there's any part of the world he doesn't know intimately, I'm sure he has at least a nodding acquaintance with it. The route over which Hitler attacked the Low Countries on May 10th, 1940, was as familiar to H.V. as the palm of his own hand. That was one of those days we had a marathon job of broadcasting to do here in the newsroom, and H.V. was our anchor man.
The main German attack today in Holland was directed against Rotterdam. The fighting in Rotterdam is going on. There is only a small, isolated German force there, a force that was brought in by plane and possibly some small numbers also by sea. And because of their surprise attack, they succeeded in seizing 3 key points in the city. The airport...
And again on December 7th, 1941, the newsroom took over the network, and again H.V. Kaltenborn was our bellwether.
Here is what has happened. President Roosevelt phoned Secretary Early half an hour ago that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States naval base on Oahu Island in the Hawaiian Islands. A few minutes later, he again phoned Mr. Early and told him that planes had attacked Manila. This means that war is underway between Japan and the United States. President Roosevelt's announcement of Japanese air attacks on United States...
Yes, H.V. is a handy man to have around a newsroom when a big story's breaking. The difficulty is keeping him in the newsroom. He wants to be right there where it's happening. Which brings up the subject of the fantastic Kaltenborn luck. On one of his whirlwind tours of the front, H.V. went up to General Bradley's headquarters at Verdun. The NBC correspondent there was Red Miller. He'd been there a month and hadn't been able to get a broadcast out because of atmospheric static. But Kaltenborn showed up, and wham, the elements cleared, and H.V.'s voice came booming through to the people of America. 5 minutes later, they settled down again, and Red Muller wasn't able to make a broadcast until they got up to Luxembourg. There was talk at the time of changing Red's nickname to Whitey. Then there was H.V.'s tour of the Pacific in 1943, during the war when he interviewed General MacArthur.
Good evening, everybody. H.V. Kaltenborn speaking from somewhere in Australia. I came to Australia primarily to meet General MacArthur. He was worth the trip. General MacArthur does not talk politics. I don't believe he thinks politics. He is so completely absorbed in the difficult task of beating back Japan that nothing else matters now.
That signal, pumped out from 10,000 miles away from home, is a little difficult to understand, so if I may, I'll try to summarize what H.V. subsequently said, General MacArthur made a deep impression on him, one that lasted. He thought the general did not have the qualities required of a politician, but that he was a great leader, a competent administrator, and completely selfless in his devotion to duty. I came away, H.V. said, with the feeling that I'd been talking to a great man. And now we come to the subject of H.V. Kaltenborn and elections. All rumors to the contrary notwithstanding, H.V. is a great expert on American elections and the American electoral system, and he's probably had more experience with those factors than any working newsman today. During the 1944 campaigns, I recall him reminiscing about the Wilson Hughes election of 1916.
I well remember holding down the night election desk in 1916 when almost everyone went to bed sure that Charles Evans Hughes would be the next president. They woke up in the morning to find that everything depended on California. And after many more anxious hours, California finally gave the election to Woodrow Wilson because he kept us out of war.
What H.V. did not say was that the following morning, when papers all over the country were coming out with headlines announcing the election of Charles Evans Hughes, H.V. was announcing in the Eagle that the election was still undecided. He was one of the few who were right. But then, of course, there was the opposite side of the medal, the famous time when H.V. was among the many who were wrong. Election night of 1948. I remember distinctly our big setup in Studio 8H and the endless hours of broadcasting while we waited for the result. As you, of course, recall, President Truman jumped into a lead at somewheres in the beginning, but H.V. Kaltenborn was busy with his own private system of mathematical computations, and he had it figured out that the president's early lead didn't mean a thing.
Summing up, all the figures that I have had, which I have managed to compare with those of 4 years ago, indicate a gain of anywhere from 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 10% for Dewey. And we must always remember that there was only a 3% difference in the popular vote 4 years ago, so that percentage shift would certainly shift the popular vote in Dewey's favor, and that means that it would shift the electoral vote by a very much larger margin.
By midnight, H.V. saw the trend clearly. All we had to do was wait for the country vote to come in.
What you've got to remember is that since these big city returns come in earlier than the country returns, and since traditionally the big cities are more democratic than the country, these total figures are not conclusive. On a percentage basis, the record still shows that Dewey is going to have more than the number of electoral votes that he needs, but it's a close race, and other things could happen.
By 1:15 in the morning, the country vote was showing up, and H.V. detected a turning tide.
We are approaching that point which I have predicted right along, that as we got in, the country returns, the very strong lead that Truman showed in the beginning would be narrowed down. I am inclined to think that while it is a very close race on the basis of the figures as they now stand on our board, Dewey has the best chance.
At this point, let me just say this. At 5:30 in the morning, many millions of people still couldn't believe the president had been reelected. But H.V. Kaltenborn was conceding.
The thing is so closely in balance that these people who are going to bed feel that it's not going to be settled for a matter of 4, 6, or more hours. However, as I said just a little while ago, on the basis of everything that we have in hand now, it does look much more like Truman than it looks like Dewey.
And this, of course, led to the famous incident of the Truman imitation of Kaltenborn. H.V. holds the distinction of being the only radio personality who was ever imitated by a president of the United States. It happened on January 19th, 1949, at the Electoral College dinner.
And Mr. Kaltenborn was saying, well, the president is 1 million votes ahead in the popular vote. We have yet to hear. Sure that when the country vote comes in, Mr. Truman will be defeated by another 100.
Was H.V. upset by this? If you think so, you don't know your Kaltenborn. He was delighted. He made his own comment the very next day during the inaugural ceremony.
Today, in serious mood, the President painted a picture of the divided world in which we live and told us how we propose to lead it to better days. Last night, President Truman, in light-hearted mood, gave his Electoral College hosts a side-splitting imitation of radio commentator H.V. Kaltenborn making wrong predictions on election night. In doing that, and in the genial way in which he did it, he proved once again that for the next 4 years we can all be human with Truman. Beware that man in place of power who has no sense of humor.
To which we can all say, amen. But now I think I've done more than my share of reminiscing about H.V., so I'd like to introduce some of the people from other networks who've worked with him through the years. Bill Henry of Mutual. Bill, when did you first run into the man?
My first recollection of H.V. Kaltenborn dates back fairly far. We were over in Germany. I was over there checking up on the preparations for the 1936 Olympic Games and was having the usual difficulty that any American has in getting to see anyone over there or to do anything. And ran into H.V. over there, and he certainly was the boy. I never saw a fellow who could get into so many places so quickly with so little introduction and with so little fuss and get along so well. I think one of the many advantages that H.V. had over most of us was his wonderful ability to speak the languages. After a good many years of knocking around the world, I'm convinced that you can only say you have mastered a language when you can out-talk a telephone operator in any foreign country. And when you can go to Germany and out-talk a German telephone operator and get a German telephone number, it's a pretty good trick. When you can do that in France, it's an even better trick, and I'm inclined to believe that it would not be beyond the powers of H.V. Kaltenborn to get a telephone number in Portugal, which I consider to be the absolute acme of difficulty.
Thanks, Bill. We asked Bob Trout of CBS for some of his reminiscences of H.V. Kaltenborn, but Bob said he'd rather stay in character as a newsman, so here now with his analysis of H.V. Kaltenborn is Robert Trout.
As the saxophones blared and the pianos thumped, I remember H.V. Kaltenborn swinging his daughter with vigorous abandon at the inaugural ball in Washington, D.C., the night Franklin D. Roosevelt first became president on the 4th of March, 1933. And I remember H.V. the night Harry S. Truman first became president in his own right, election night, 1948, working through that fantastic night, and then the next morning, with the returns still coming in, saying goodbye to us who were still at the microphones in the NBC election headquarters, and rushing out with Mrs. Kaltenborn, but not rushing home to rest after that long night of work. H.V. was off to deliver a previously arranged lecture at Town Hall here in New York. He's a two-legged tornado, gathering more force and energy to himself as the years approach and then stagger away in dismay. Kaltenborn won't stand for any nonsense from the calendar, you know. If you're allergic to whirlwinds, don't get near a Kaltenborn anniversary party. H.V.'s idea of a quiet birthday celebration is a day full of tennis, foot races, wrestling matches, and for a finale, a swimming exhibition with himself the chief exhibitor. College athletes who carelessly accepted an invitation to a Kaltenborn outdoor party have been known to lie limply in the grass for hours afterward, too exhausted to shed tears and too stunned to ask a passerby what happened. When H.V. returns to the city after a country weekend, I've seen his two pet dogs crawl under the sofa cushions, too far gone to eat or bark. One of H.V.'s most sustained displays of energy and vigor was the Munich crisis of 1938, when I lived with him in the CBS radio studios for days on end and watched him grow fresher and more eager as the days passed and the crisis deepened. His nourishment was soup, brought in by Mrs. Kaltenborn, but he never noticed it if she happened to be late. What bothered H.V. was not a possible shortage of broth, but a possible shortage of events to analyze on the air. He would give a keen analysis of anything or anybody, even before anyone dropped a hat. Well, the years do roll on, and I'm not getting any younger. And all I can say is, I wish I knew why H.V. Kaltenborn is.
Thank you, Bob. And now for one of the stars of the American Broadcasting Company, Elmer Davis. Elmer, if he wanted, could remember H.V. way back. He was on the New York Times from 1914 to 1924, the same period during which H.V. was on the Eagle. Elmer?
Any man in the radio news business is honored to be permitted to join in this festschrift to Hans Kaltenborn, whom we all admire for his technical virtuosity and for a deeper reason. I first appreciated that virtuosity some 15 years ago when he had a Sunday night network news analysis program, Sustaining. I was then pretty much of an amateur in the trade, but I was occasionally asked to fill in for him when he was abroad or sick. One Sunday they called me up and told me Kaltenborn had a bad cold and could I substitute. So I wrote a script, turned up at the studio in due time, and just before I was to go on the air, Kaltenborn turned up too. Well, it was his show. He had only a few notes scribbled on the back of an envelope, but he turned in and ad-libbed a 15-minute analysis of the news of the day, as good as I'd been able to do in hours of work. So good that my disappointment was drowned in admiration. Why was I disappointed? Because if I'd gone on instead of Kaltenborn, I'd have got $75, the going rate for sustaining news analysis in those days, and I needed it. Why did Kaltenborn get up from a sick bed to go on the air? Because in those days, he needed $75 too. But a year or so later came his magnificent marathon performance in the Munich crisis, when he analyzed the news around the clock for day after day, and that was what really put the radio news business in the important money. For this profounder reason, every one of us who works at this trade should be as grateful to Kaltenborn as every Texan should be to the man who first brought in an oil well.
Thank you very much, Elmer. Now I think we have a bit of a scoop here. Edward R. Murrow of CBS has been on a vacation, and I believe this will be his first radio appearance since his return just a few hours ago.
Now, what can one say about an old friend like Hans Kaltenborn? In public, that is. He can spot me 2 or 3 decades and still beat me at tennis. He can make the news intelligible to children, which means I can understand him, too. There were times when this was not so. In the days when the great storm of war was building up in Europe, this reporter would do what he fondly thought was a definitive analysis of what was happening in Europe. And when the piece was finished, would pick up the headphones in London and hear the clipped and much more authoritative voice of H.V. saying from New York, "Now what Mr. Murrow meant to say was this." And there would then follow an analysis of my analysis. And at times, when it was over, I understood myself and what I meant the better. Mr. Kaltenborn once analyzed a prayer or speech by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was better than the Archbishop. Briefer, too. Seriously, I should like to offer an oral salute to this young man who has great promise and whose friendship does not depend upon agreement.
Thank you, Ed Morrow. And finally, we have here one of radio's most gracious ladies, Mary Margaret McBride of ABC. H.V. has guest starred on Miss McBride's program countless times, and I understand she's got a good story or two about him. How about it, M.N.?
The first time I asked H.V. Kaltenborn to come on my program, I was just scared to death. See, I had this enormous and awed respect for him as the dean of commentators and for his marvelous ability to ad-lib on any and all occasions. When he told me he'd come, I was thrilled, but I stayed very nervous and worried. And he came in late that day. I thought he isn't coming. But I know now he was late because he had something he wanted to conceal from me until the right moment. As I started to introduce him, he drew out from under the table a bunch of dewy, fresh violets and handed them to me with the most courtly bow. Well, I rose right up and kissed him a good hearty smack right on the air. The dean of commentators. I didn't have any more awe for him. And that broke the ice. And next time I had him, I introduced him as Spider Legs Coffee. That's what they used to call him. And I'll never forget his wonderful big laugh when he heard me say, "Well, we have with us today Spider Legs Coffee." The other thing I remember particularly about H.V. Kaltenborn is the night at the political conventions in Philadelphia when he described the dance of a coochie, well, one of those dances, you know. And he described it with gestures in his voice, and I don't think anybody will ever forget it. The dean of commentators, bless him, and many more years to him. I love him.
And now, Here's the man we've all been talking about, Mr. H.V. Kaltenborn himself.
It is a heartwarming experience to hear such friendly tributes and recollections from my colleagues and associates. If it is true that the first 30 years are the hardest, and I have my doubts, the rest of the way should be made even more easy by what I've heard tonight. I look back on 30 fascinating years in the development of this great new medium of communication, years which paralleled the growth of my native land into world leadership. 54 years ago, I was a soldier in the Spanish War that first made America a world power. 2 weeks ago, I returned from a reporter's survey trip through Europe, completely dependent on the United States for its economic support and its military defense. When you have been on the air as long as I have, you accumulate memories and a good deal of mail. For 30 years, I've saved the letters that have been written to me about my radio broadcasts. The attic in my home is filled with them. Each spring, my wife threatens a flaming holocaust. To make her see the importance of these historic treasures, I asked my secretary to start indexing this fan mail by topics. Looking over her files, I found one of the first folders captioned Animal Names. She has only covered 1922 and 23, but already there is a choice assortment of zoological characterizations. Here are a few of the animals of which I remind my early listeners: pig, jackass, warthog, mule, vulture, snake, rat, monkey, louse, and skunk. Another folder was marked political. Under this, my secretary filed letters which called me fascist, communist, red baiter, reactionary, Bolshevik, Republican, Democrat, Socialist, Prohibitionist, Booze Hound, and even Technocrat. Of course, this is flattering because it shows that even my early broadcasts stirred emotion and reaction. I have always remembered the biblical words, "So then, because thou art lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spew thee out of my mouth." How did I ever get into broadcasting? Back in 1922, a freak invention called radio was exciting popular interest. The owners of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, where I was an editor, thought radio might have possibilities. I was known for my gift of gab, and it was decided to make me the Brooklyn Eagle's radio voice. The mellifluous accents to which you are now listening did the rest. It's only natural that tonight my mind goes back to some of the memorable experiences of my radio career. There was the time when I broadcast a
Now
real
listen, darling. You've been talking long enough. Stop. For 42 years, I've made it my business to interrupt you when you talk too long. As your wife, I consider that one of my most important functions. As you know, the woman must always have the last word. And so for both of us, I want to thank NBC, your generous colleagues, and your friendly listeners for the tributes they have voiced. And incidentally, I agree with all they have said. So let me close by saying as you do, good night.
Mrs. Kaltenborn, we can never thank you enough. And from all of us in the National Broadcasting Company, HV, love and kisses to you and to the missus, and our brightest expectations for another 30 years of broadcasting at least. Now this is Ben Grauer, transcribed, saying good night.
Motorists are reminded that failure to reduce speed causes many accidents. A car that can't be stopped is a car out of control, and a car out of control is an accident in the making. Next, it's Night Beat on NBC.